Welcome to our overview of the Section 106 process. I am Natalie B., the Competitive Review Supervisor of the Land and Water Conservation Fund, LWCF, as well as the Outdoor Recreation Legacy Partnership, or LIP programs, in the Office of Grants and Local Services, OGALS.
Hi, thank you, Natalie. Hi, my name is Chris Corey, and I'm a senior state archaeologist assisting OGALS with Section 106 consultation for these two federal programs.
You are most likely here because you've been asked by our office to proceed with this federal requirement for either LWCF or ORLIP. This video is designed to break down the process so applicants can get off to a good start. Please know that the entire Section 106 process can take several months, sometimes up to 6 months. Therefore, time is of the essence, as National Park Service will not obligate the project's funding until Section 106 is complete. Once funding is obligated, project groundbreaking can begin. I'll now hand it over to Chris, who will give a high-level overview of what Section 106 is, why it's required, and then we'll walk you through the process on where to begin.
Thank you, Natalie. What is Section 106? Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, NHPA, requires federal agencies to consider the effects of their undertakings on historic properties. Section 106 is triggered when a project involves federal funding. The Section 106 process seeks to address historic preservation concerns with the needs of federal undertakings through consultation between the California State Parks Office of Grants and Local Services, OGALS, grant applicants, Native American tribes, members of the public, and the Office of Historic Preservation. The goal of the Section 106 process is to identify and avoid, minimize, or mitigate adverse effects on historic properties. The process has 4 basic steps: establishment of the undertaking, identification and evaluation of historic properties, assessment of the effects to historic properties, and resolution of any adverse effects. What is an undertaking? Under the Section 106 regulations and the National Historic Preservation Act, an undertaking is broadly defined as any project, activity, or program with federal agency involvement. What is a historic property? A historic property is defined in the National Historic Preservation Act as any prehistoric or historic district, site, building, structure, or object included in or eligible for inclusion on the National Register of Historic Places. What is an adverse effect? An adverse effect is found when the undertaking may alter, directly or indirectly, any of the characteristics of a historic property that qualify that property for inclusion in the National Register in a manner that would diminish the integrity of the property's location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, or association. At this point, you might be asking yourself, I feel like we've already assessed these impacts during our CEQA analysis. What is the difference? Let's go over some of those. Section 106 applies only to projects with federal funding, whereas CEQA applies only to projects before California agencies. 106 focuses on historic properties, whereas CEQA is focused on cultural and other environmental resources. 106 requires a formal process for consultation and evaluation of historical resources with the State Historic Preservation Officer over historic properties, whereas CEQA does not mandate consultation with SHPO on cultural resources. Section 106 assesses whether there will be an effect on any of the characteristics that qualify the property for inclusion in the National Register of Historic Places, or NRHP, in a manner that would diminish the integrity of the property's location, setting, design, workmanship, feeling, or association. Contrary to CEQA, that will assess whether the project has a significant effect that would result in a substantial adverse change in the significance of the resource to justify its eligibility for inclusion in the California Register of Historic Resources, or the CRHR. The outcomes of a Section 106 evaluation will have a finding of either no effect, no adverse effect, or an adverse effect to historic properties. With that, how do you reach the goal of Section 106 process of identifying and avoiding, minimizing, or mitigating adverse effects to historic properties? Let's jump into the instructions for Section 106, and I'll hand it back over to Natalie to get us started.
Chris, the
Yeah.
Section 106 instructions are located here on the Land and Water Conservation Fund application process webpage. Since you're listening to this video, I'm sure you have already found the location of where the instructions are on the Land and Water page. They're right here. We're going to go ahead and click on this. At the top of this document, there's a brief explanation of what Section 106 is, which Chris just explained a few moments ago. And one addition I want to point out is that if Section 106 was performed within the last 5 years, say you already had federal funding at this site within the last 5 years, and it covers the undertaking that is being proposed for Land and Water, it is unlikely that you'll have to go through the Section 106 process again. We'd like you to please submit your SHPO concurrence letter that you've received and the consultation package for our review. Here in bold highlight, it is very important to remember that Section 106 must be completed before any ground disturbance can take place. Now, the chart below outlines each step of the process, and we'll review it together. Step 1, well, we're here. So our office has notified you to please begin the process. And we'll jump to step 2. Before I talk about the consultant selection, the first thing I want to point out is that the Office of Historic Preservation has a checklist for Section 106. This is a really good link to click on, as it will provide a lot of detail about the ins and outs of Section 106 and its requirements. We will go into this checklist a little bit later in our presentation. But first, let's talk about consultant selection. The applicant needs to hire a consultant that meets the professional qualification standards set by the Secretary of the Interior, found in the Code of Federal Regulations, Title 36, Chapter 1, Part 61. And you can find it at this link right here. This is probably the most critical step. If a consultant is selected that is not well-versed and experienced in Section 106 and National Register evaluations, it can end up being more costly and cause undue delays in completing Section 106 and receiving concurrence from the SHPO. There is a list of consultants on the California Historical Resources Information Systems website, Chris, right here. However, please note that the consultant list is maintained by the Eastern Information Center. And so California State Parks is not endorsing nor guaranteeing the consultants on this list are qualified to perform Section 106. It is very important and is the responsibility of the local agency to determine if the consultant is indeed qualified, one that is well-versed in both archaeology and historic architecture, and meets the professional qualification standards found in 36 CFR Part 61. I will now turn it over to Chris, and he will cover the first step that your consultant will do.
Thank you, Natalie. Okay, let's look at step 3. This step is important because it sets the parameters of what area may be affected given the scope of the project. First, the consultant will describe the proposed scope of work, applicable maps, and a description of the area of potential effect, or APE. The APE needs to include the horizontal and vertical extents of the proposed work, including ancillary and support locations such as staging and laydown areas, access routes, borrow and disposal area, and mitigation parcels if there are any. Provide a description of these steps taken to identify the APE and a justification for the APE boundaries chosen. The APE should also take indirect effects into account. Example are visual and auditory effects, land use changes, traffic patterns, public access, etc. The indirect APE should be clearly described. Upon determining what the area of a potential effect will be, please request this letter template, and upon completion, send it to Natalie in Word format, along with the exhibits shown at the bottom of the letter to support the APE boundaries. The APE map should be a copy of the 7.5-minute USGS topographic quad, including the appropriate detail and scale. More than one map may be necessary to clearly outline the APE and label all project elements discussed in the project description. Now let's take a look at step 4. In step 4, OGALS will send the APE letter to the Office of Historic Preservation, who will assure the APE is adequate. Upon approval, OGALS will notify you to proceed to step 5. Now I'll turn it back to Natalie, and she'll cover the first few bullet points under step 5.
Thank you, Chris. Okay, so congratulations. You're now at the point where you can proceed with step 5, which is identification of historic properties and finding of effect. For this section, you will be referring to the OHP checklist, section 4 and section 5. So I'll click on it once more and scroll down to section 4. Starts here with the identification of historic properties. And then it proceeds with a lot of detail. So this, again, is a great tool to refer to as you're going through the Section 106 process. But going back to our process document and our instructions, within this step, the first thing you're going to do is request a record search through CRIS Information Center. There are 9 information centers throughout the state. You will find the one that handles the county of your project site. It's generally a few $100s for the record search, and the information center will provide a report of historical resources data on file for the approved APE and half-mile perimeter. The next step in number 5 is to conduct tribal consultation through the Native American Heritage Commission. Start this process right away. As we've heard, it can take several weeks to receive a list of tribal contacts back from the Native American Heritage Commission. You'll want to use this form here, which is the Sacred Lands file and Native American Contact List Request. So you'll fill this out and send it to the Native American Heritage Commission, and they will return a list of tribal representatives that are associated to your project site within that area. Upon receipt of the list, make sure to send a letter to each tribal representative on the list. by certified mail and email. OHP will be double checking to make sure that each representative was contacted and provided an opportunity to consult. If there's no response, please make sure to follow up via phone or email to make sure and also make sure that you document each attempt. Submit your log of attempts along with your consultation package once you're at the final stage of preparing that and sending it to our office. At this point, I will turn it back to Chris, and he will finish off the last few bullets under step number 5 of our procedure.
Thank you, Natalie. At this point, the consultant is responsible for preparing a survey for historic properties within the area of potential effects and surrounding area of the project for identification of historic properties and determining the appropriate finding of effect per section 4 and 5 in the OHP checklist as your guide. A key component to remember is to make sure the evaluation not only includes the individual components within the APE, but also the project site itself to determine eligibility to the National Register. The finding of effect will be determined using National Register evaluation criteria, including integrity of the property's location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, association, among other things. The consultant will be seeking to determine whether this project will have no effect, no adverse effect, or an adverse effect to historic properties. Let's look at step 6 now. The final step is that the consultant prepares a cover letter summarizing the evaluation efforts and the recommended finding of effect, seeking concurrence from the State Historic Preservation Officer, or SHPO. On your screen, you'll see we have another template letter for your use. Please request this template from Natalie. The letter from the applicant's consultant must contain the following items: a summary of the undertaking and approved APE, and summary of the efforts to identify historic properties. A letter from the California Historic Resources Information Center, CRIS, or Information Center, with a record search of the APE and a half-mile perimeter around the APE. Record of Native American Heritage Center, NAHC, request for file search and a list of the project area's most likely descendants or tribal representatives. Verification of tribal contacts from all persons on the list with a record of names, dates, and methods of contact, both email and certified mail. A list of comments from Native American tribal respondents, a record of attempts to follow up with non-respondents, the results of the consultation with the interested Native American tribal representatives, identification and evaluation of historic properties, including the survey reports, documentation of the assessment of the proposed project's effect to historic properties that are either no historic properties affected, no adverse effect, or an adverse effect, using the National Register criteria for evaluation. And finally, a recommended finding of effect. Again, please use this template shown on the screen. This is a consistent format that the Office of Historic Preservation prefers to review, and if this format is used, the package should contain all necessary information for the Section 106 consultation process. Submit the complete package to Natalie, who will forward it on to OHP for consultation. That concludes the Section 106 process. Please know that once OLGAL sends the complete package to the Office of Historic Preservation, they have 30 days for their review and to send a concurrence letter or ask for additional information. In order for Section 106 to be complete, the project must have a letter of concurrence from the State Historic Preservation Officer. OGAL submits the concurrence letter to National Park Service, who will proceed with approving the project's funding and establishing a project start date. I hope this tutorial video was helpful. Please reach out to Natalie for any additional questions you may have, and thank you.